Hello, I'm James Derian, Director of the Center for National Security Studies and host of our 6th Global Forum on the COVID crisis, Lessons Learned, What Next? Our topic today is one that's not going to go away. It seems to be growing in importance. It's on the slow-moving data coup d'etat and the relationship between technologies of communication and disinformation and the pandemic. I've borrowed this title from a social theorist who warned almost 2 decades ago of this sort of slow-moving data coup d'etat. And it seems over the 6, maybe 5 last years, we've been experiencing something very akin to this sort of takeover by the infosphere. What does this mean? What are the consequences for global politics, for geopolitics, for human security? These are all some of the issues we're going to be tackling today. But before we begin, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I wish not only to acknowledge elders past, present, and emergent, but also to acknowledge their suffering from a pandemic, the very first one on this land, when the Gadigal people were nearly decimated, nearly wiped out by infectious diseases brought by the Europeans. So not something new we're looking at today. It's been with us, and it attacks people of different races and different classes and different cultures, at different rates, and certainly with different consequences. So that's important to keep in mind. Now, for those joining us for the first time, the Global Forum was put together to really look reflexively, critically, and quickly at breaking issues. And we are carrying on that tradition of dealing with issues in a timely manner with the COVID crisis and its consequences. This is being recorded and edited and will be available on the CISS YouTube channel. And we like to make this as interactive as possible. So after we hear from our group of panelists, we will then go to a Q&A from the chat room. Please, if you have any questions, just submit them in the Q&A down at the bottom of your Zoom page. So with us today, we have Olga, my new colleague, Boichak, who's joined us, and she's a sociologist of digital media. She's a lecturer in digital cultures, and we wanted to welcome her because she brings a really multidisciplinary approach to this question, well-versed in ethnographic methods, but also in the technical side of digital media. So she looks at, particularly in the context of non-Western states in her area of the Ukraine, and I'm particularly interested in how Olga's developing a whole new set of concepts to help us grapple with these issues, particularly the one of human geopolitics. So we're going to be looking at that in a minute. I'm very happy to have with us once again Ron Deibert, who's a professor of political science, but also probably you know him all as the director of the Citizen Lab at the Munch Center at the University of Toronto. He's overseen this lab for many years. It started small, it's grown, and it's now, I would say, an NGO in its own right, a global player in its investigatory digital journalism. And we are very lucky as well because Ron's just published a book that I just finished last night, Ron. I just want to tell you, this is Reset. I tell you, I don't want to pick up a cell phone or a smartphone after reading this ever again. It's terrifying, but it's also very hopeful. Reset in the sense of reboot, and the subtitle is Reclaiming the Internet for Civil Society. So if you don't have a copy yet, it's available, and it's part of the famous Massey lectures of the leading public intellectuals who give this once a year. I assume, Ram, that the lectures went well, or are you in the midst of them?
Well, we had to mix them up a bit this year. Normally they're delivered across the country of Canada in 5 different cities to a live audience. So instead, I pre-recorded them in an empty CBC headquarters, and they were broadcast old school, like the old days, over radio. And yeah, they're done, and it went quite well. Thank you for noting those.
So radio killed the video. That's lovely. I like that. We're going back to retrograde technologies. That's wonderful. But I think I'm going to start with Ron, only because I woke up this morning after staying up way too late reading the book. to another report from Citizen Lab. And this one hit close to home, and we might even have a scoop. So I'm going to ask Ron to talk a little bit about the latest report from Citizen Lab because it deals directly with some of these issues. And then we'll get more directly into the implications of this data coup d'etat and the interrelationships with the pandemic. But Ron, tell us a little bit about your latest report and why we should be bothered by this in the Indo-Pacific region.
Sure, thank you, James. And let me just say it's great to be on this panel. I wish I was in Sydney with all of my friends and colleagues there, but this is a nice second best. So the report that you mentioned, thank you for flagging it, just out a couple of hours ago, actually. It involves our investigation into a surveillance company called Circles, which provides a unique kind of surveillance service to government clients. And at the root of this surveillance service is the exploitation of a relatively unknown, maybe people in the industry, in the telecommunications industry know this well, but largely outside of it, most people are unaware of something called SS7. And this is a protocol that's used to exchange routing information between large telecommunication networks around the globe, and was developed in 1975 in order to handle kind of, roaming of new mobile networks that was emerging then. The problem is that this protocol is highly vulnerable to exploitation. And when it was developed, there was no authentication mechanisms around who could access this protocol and send instructions and receive information about cell phones connected to networks globally. And so anyone with access to the SS7 network can identify where any device is at any time in the world. In other words, geolocated device that's connected to any cell phone network, and can also intercept voice calls as well as SMS messages. Now, as the telecommunications industry has expanded and evolved, especially in the 80s and 90s, it went through waves of privatization and deregulation. All sorts of new players entered into the space, new countries with not very good governance and management over their local telecommunications firms had access to the SS7 protocol. And so naturally it's ripe for abuse. And in the course of doing this investigation around this one firm, Circles, which was founded in 2008 to assist government security services in exploiting this SS7 protocol, we discovered that we could scan the entire internet, and I won't get into all the details of how this work was done. It was led by brilliant Citizen Lab senior researcher Bill Marzak. We were able to identify all of the government clients of Circle, 25 government clients, and in some cases, the specific agencies of those governments that were the clients of Circles. And the big picture here is that a number of them have very poor human rights records. So in other words, these are countries that almost certainly will abuse this technology to target activists, dissidents, opposition figures, whether in their own countries or abroad. You mentioned the Indo-Pacific findings. Well, we did discover that there are a number of countries in that region that are clients of Circles, including Australia. Unfortunately, we were unable to determine the exact government client, but whoever it is based in Canberra, so that narrows the that narrows the scope a little bit. And I would really urge any Australian journalists who are listening to this panel and who may be interested to follow up on the details that we have. If you look in the appendix, we have all of the information about the Australian client. I will just sum up by saying, and really kind of pivoting back to the main theme of this panel, the telecommunications infrastructure that we rely on for all that we do today is characterized by a number of main features. It's highly insecure, poorly regulated, and prone to abuse. And that those characteristics of the telecommunication infrastructure, I would say, can be broadened to cover just about everything in terms of our entire communications ecosystem. And of course, during the pandemic, a lot of people are really, worried for good reason about this or that contact tracing application, whether, this will open up some kind of abuse of surveillance, when in fact, we've kind of backed into, out of necessity, a full-on embrace of this communications ecosystem, which I believe will only amplify some of the pathologies that I outline in Reset. And yeah, so it's a very big concern I have, and look forward to talking to you and others and those who are watching about some of these issues.
I do want to get back to this this issue of how we're sort of buying into our own surveillance, self-surveillance, in the what you call the technological or telecommunications ecosystem. But first, I want to go to Olga, because Olga, I'm fascinated because you're looking at this as well from the perspective of activism. Digital media is obviously has this two-sided character to it, and can be used to surveil, and power can dominate through it, but it can also be turned back on power. And tell us a little bit about your own work in this area, particularly in non-Western areas, but also in some of the shadows of the infosphere that you've been investigating.
Thank you so much, James, and thank you for having me here. It's a big pleasure to be part of this forum. So my research is mostly in the domain of digital war, and I'm looking at the emerging modes of crisis sociality and of just human sociality that happen at the backdrop of conflicts, and how people could use digital media for various kinds of involvement in military conflicts, and what this means for the future of armed conflicts. And so looking at my research is not directly related to the COVID pandemic, but it actually extends nicely to see what people are doing really when the pandemic is happening. And so seeing the COVID pandemic as a viral event, which is really interesting from both standpoints, right? It's a viral event in a literal sense, but also it is a viral information event that, and so also drawing on Paul Virelia's ideas about the aesthetics of disappearance, and this understanding that biosphere is completely engulfed in the infosphere, and while the biosphere gradually rots away and disappears behind these data-based representation, which is how we know about what's going on in the world and what's going on with the pandemic. I would like to investigate those techniques of the observer to see how the COVID pandemic has maybe added to our understanding of human sociality in times of crisis, and also the lockdown aesthetics. There's a lot of spectacle going on also around the pandemic, and understanding it as a form of aesthetic, maybe drawing on Paul Virelia and maybe not as much, I think is really interesting. So I was thinking, getting ready for this forum, I was thinking whether a COVID pandemic can be compared to war. And because I thought that was a very interesting question. One thing that I definitely do not think that it is a war in a Clausewitzian way. However, if we look at the idea of human geopolitics, which is just the idea that the competition in the wars is for population and not for territory, I think we definitely saw this in the U.S. elections just 2 weeks ago, when we realized that if we map the population onto territories, it really doesn't provide an accurate representation of the electoral preferences and such. And so this is drawing on Alan Gamlin's work. His book on human geopolitics has just came out in 2019. And so from the perspective of human geography, understanding that this competition for population has always preceded violent conflicts until about the 17th century, when the Peace of Westphalia has kind of solidified this international relations system and the idea of territorial sovereignty and such. So in the light of the rise of diaspora institutions in many countries that are making attempts to perhaps control or direct their populations living in other countries, their diasporas, is something that I'm really interested in, and I'm really interested in how those diasporas get involved in armed conflicts back home. So if we compare this pandemic to a war, we can maybe talk about the civilian military, like when we talk about the civilian military ratio of war-related fatalities, maybe we could also talk about the ratio of medical staff and essential workers in COVID-related fatalities. And this is something that we haven't really tracked so far. And this is something that really came to the fore in this pandemic. We could talk about maybe biopolitics by other means or have some other metaphors, but overall, I think, these are just some of my initial considerations.
No, it's fascinating, and I think the sort of the tail wagging the dog of the diaspora here, we've seen that from as soon as there was this new, means of, instant communications that amplified their power. I'm thinking, Ron, in fact, of the Toronto pizza owner in the Yugoslavian war who had an incredible impact on Serbian nationalism and in that conflict, and of course during the Iraq War, the diaspora creating this basically disinformation campaign about whether or not there were weapons of mass destruction. So there's been a long, between those two wars, a long litany of diasporic politics using telecommunications very effectively, and also misinformation campaigns. And sometimes it's very hard. Ron, you've looked a lot at sort of black flag operations, and it's very hard to see where the misinformation or disinformation starts. If the information is being planted in these communities and then disseminated. You did some early work on this, I believe, on how disinformation spreads. Do you have a particular case that could illustrate that, or just say something in general about how difficult it is to find that return address on these campaigns?
Well, before I get into that, I'll just say with respect to diaspora populations, generally speaking, I think it's true that obviously the internet and digital technologies have enabled people to have a global voice that they didn't before and communicate to a large audience globally, to connect with others in other countries, including their home countries. And you see that, I think, not only through the type of, amplification that you're talking about, and even maybe disinformation, but also just in terms of financial support. Early information networks were used in a lot of ways to send remittances, and still are, of course. But to me, the most striking characteristic of this topic is how the conventional wisdom around how the internet would empower these groups has really been turned on its head. And I write a bit about this in Reset. It's certainly a major feature of our research. We've seen the broadening of techniques of transnational repression. So, simplifying things, decades ago, if you left the country where you were under some kind of repression to a relatively safe country abroad, it gave you a degree of protection. But that protection has really been dissolved almost entirely through the technologies of the sort that we're highlighting in this report. So thanks to companies like Circles, NSO Group, and others like them, authoritarian regimes now have a whole palette of tools that they didn't have before that have enabled them to identify, locate, and neutralize members of diaspora that they consider to be a pain. And there are a lot of them, right? And this is, I can see firsthand in terms of the discussions I have with the people who are the targets, and even the general community of people of which they're a part, there is a fear that has descended into these communities. Fear of being watched, fear of using these, the very technologies that we're using right now, because either they had their own devices hacked and they've seen what effects it's had on their family members back home, or perhaps it's led to some kind of lethal consequence, even murder in a lot of cases, or there's a lot of false information going around about how to secure your devices and so on. When it comes to disinformation, the question you ask, disinformation has been going on, I don't need to tell either of you this, for centuries, really. But what's unique about the current environment is that social media constituted under the regime of surveillance capitalism, the business model that drives a lot of the content that we see online, is really the perfect environment for disinformation to spread and flourish. It's as if you couldn't design a better ecosystem for it. And of course, that is leading to all sorts of experimentation. I think often, James, about a term that you coined. I don't think you meant it to apply to this area, but the military, industrial, media, and entertainment complex. Back then, you were talking mostly about big Hollywood productions that were done in coordination with agencies of the US government, the military especially. Now we have a variant of that, which is dark PR. Enormous, very profitable firms are sprouting up, not to place, US-friendly, troop-friendly imagery in blockbuster Hollywood productions, but to actually seed inauthentic information, largely to discredit the adversaries of both big business as well as governments. And this is, again, one of those areas which is poorly regulated, highly prone to abuse, takes great advantage of the kind of parasitic underbelly of the social media environment, which is the advertising industry and the location tracking industry. So what we highlighted with Circles is just one example of this kind of cesspool of bottom feeder companies that make money by deriving revenue by tracking people's locations based on the applications on their devices, and then selling them to either dark PR firms, private security services, bounty hunters, intelligence agencies. So it is really a complicated, confusing mix of factors now that's shaping this environment. And a lot of it is taking place under the surface. Now, you ask about how easy it is to track. We spend a lot of time at Citizen Lab doing this, as do other groups. And what we're doing is we're trying to apply technical means to gather evidence, right? We're not observing what we can see at the surface. We have refined over, close to 20 years now, a variety of methods to access data feeds, scan the internet, tools like that, to gather forensic evidence, to try to piece together who is behind. It's not always possible because it is, if you're skilled enough, you can obfuscate the origins of where you're coming from. But today's report is a good example of how that's not always the case. Even the most sophisticated Israeli-based surveillance vendors leave tracks if you know where to look. And we've been able quite successfully to expose a lot of that hidden underbelly using these methods.
I have a question prompted by, you're examining this sometimes tension, sometimes collusion between the private and public when it comes to disinformation for both of you. And when you invoke, thank you for invoking the Military Industrial Media Entertainment Network. Where do you see the balance of power there? Is it shifting more towards the private, or because I'm thinking about, you mentioned the long history of disinformation going back to active measures during the Cold War between, the CIA and the KGB, and even now when you look at like units in Russia, the power of this, unit, I think it's 26165 that, hacked the DNC and really helped get Trump elected. I mean, that's pretty much, the consensus viewpoint. That's a government-based, very powerful, a lot of resources, so really we're getting here to like, how do geopolitical interest and private interest, where do they clash, where do they collude in these disinformation campaigns? Olga, have you come across this in your work where, it's like hybrid warfare, we see how clearly Russia has been able to, use the full spectrum of, everything from information warfare to, kinetic war, but, and then hire private mercenaries as, cutouts. Where is there a line that's being blurred between the private, the state interest? You were talking about the monopoly of violence that came out of Westphalia. It gave so much, power to the states in these matters. But is that monopoly of violence being diffused, and what are the consequences for politics, geopolitics?
I think that because after the Peace of Westphalia, we in the social sciences have started making those assumptions of territory-based things, and so that is one. So countries became as our unit of analysis, and that's why with social media that blur the distinction between privacy and publicness and somehow elide that distinction altogether, because a lot of the times when people are online, they even sometimes have reasonable expectations of privacy, and they believe that what they're doing online doesn't really contribute to anything. But I think that the notion of the national web and understanding that countries are in a way reflected online, and our location really affects how we experience information based on where we are, based on the kinds of devices we're using, based on a number of other settings. And just the fact that those national webs online, which basically consists, this is drawing on Richard Rogers's work, and so understanding a national web as a sphere that consists of interlinking web spheres of people who speak the national language or identify as a member of that nation, or are interested in topics having to do with that nation. So if we think of those boundaries of those national webs, that is where those attempts at orchestrated interference can be really seen. And so in my research, the one that I did with Priya Kumar from Global Affairs Canada, I was a visiting scholar at Ryerson University. And so what we did is we collected all of the communication on Facebook among Ukrainian diasporas in Canada, and we tried to see what kinds of topics they were discussing. So we did it over a span of 4 years, from 2014, when the conflict in Ukraine had just started, up until 2018, when Facebook had closed off its APIs and data collection was no longer possible on the scale that it used to be. And so we're trying to see whether they're discussing the events in Ukraine, how they're discussing it, whether they're engaging in direct humanitarian response, which is a new kind of behavior that I'm finding that is fostered in a way by social media, because we can see these direct horizontal relationships between the communities in crisis and diasporas. What we saw was, so we saw a lot of hyperlinking behaviors. And so as a part of that project, we were investigating what were the diasporic actors in those public groups on Facebook linking to. What kinds of information, where was it produced? How was that information used to mobilize the diaspora as a group? And in some groups, we did find a lot of gray area content that was just put out there. And so understanding that just because this is a diasporic community, it really doesn't have any veracity on the claims that people are making that are part of the group, just because it's so prone to interference, it's public, it's visible for all. And so I guess more kind of in-depth and qualitative analysis, even for what's on the surface, right? Ron has, in Citizen Lab, you have your own tools of looking and investigating forensically these things. We just looked on the surface, and we looked de facto what was shared, where was it produced, what is this resource saying, and saw really heavy-handed attempts at intervening into the discourse, and maybe some disinformation.
Ron, maybe you could say a word. You use to, I think, good effect, Sheila Zubkov's concept of surveillance capitalism. But, is that something that you see as ascendant and challenging or undermining state sovereignty, or do you see it working hand in hand when it comes to, being a danger to human security?
I'm not sure how it situates next to state sovereignty. I don't kind of think of those categories in that way. I will say, back to the original question about relative authority and influence between, state actors and even the threat actors coming out of places like Russia. Generally speaking, I think it's fair to describe trends over the last, essentially since the end of the Cold War. We've had a lot of hollowing out of the state, a lot of privatization, security services, good example. Things that used to be traditionally supplied by the state are outsourced to the private sector. And at the same time, we've seen a gradual erosion of accountability, public accountability, and the growth of kleptocracy. and the rise of authoritarianism. So all of these factors, these are, kind of tectonic forces, are the way I see them, and they are combining in a way to produce the kind of negative externalities that we see. Social media and surveillance capitalism just happens to work very well in terms of providing a kind of enabling environment for a lot of the things that bad actors want to do. It obviously wasn't designed that way. For example, what we're seeing in the disinformation space, I believe, is a lot of groups out there. I'm talking about state actors, quasi-state actors, private companies are treating social media like a disinformation laboratory. So we're seeing a lot of experimentation going on. And some of it's pretty easy to identify. Some groups and some country sources tend to be pretty sloppy. And we don't really know the impact. Like even the Russian interference, if you look at some of the studies on, did it actually change people's minds and so on? I think there's a more nuanced understanding that actually a lot of the sources of confusion, misinformation, disinformation were actually domestic in origin. And it's unclear to what extent the Russian interference actually moved people one way or another. Obviously, the hack that you reference is a completely different story because of the timeliness around that. The fact that, it really discredited the legitimacy of the DNC based on the contents was interesting. But we're at an early stage, right? So surveillance capitalism also turns out to be very convenient if you're a criminal, but also an intelligence agency, especially one who works for like an autocrat or a dictator. Why? Because we all carry around these devices with us 24 hours a day next to our bedside tables. And unfortunately, they tend to be easy to exploit. And that's part of the software, the engineering ecosystem that we live in as well. Security problems are largely passed on to consumers. There's no liability really for companies. Stuff moves very quickly, move fast and break things. All of this is perfect, right? If you're thinking about, okay, I've got these meddlesome people in Canada, let's say, that are organizing over social media, criticizing me constantly for my human rights record. What am I going to do? Well, I'm going to contract with a large consulting firm like McKinsey and Company. And this, by the way, this is a true story of what Saudi Arabia did to identify who are the big social media influencers. And, McKinsey just goes out and scrapes social media to identify who are those people. And then they go out and they contract with another surveillance vendor to then hack into those devices silently and watch everything that they're doing. And then identify the ones that are real key organizers and go out and murder them, i.e. what happened to Jamal Khashoggi. Now this is big business. It's highly corrupt, and it's kind of symptomatic of the world that we live in. I think, if I was to throw a label out there, I think we live in an age of Pax kleptocracy, right? Like it's like we've kind of, ever since the end of the Cold War and waves of liberalization and deregulation have vaulted into prominence, these highly corrupt individuals and organizations that cross-cut private companies and state agencies. So it's no longer easy to just say, oh, you have sovereign states over here and private sector over here, the way that international relations people kind of conceptualize these things. It doesn't really compute for me in the world, at least that I'm navigating through and trying to understand in the work that we do.
I keep my eye open to see if that catches on. Pax kleptocracy. It's an interesting, almost oxymoron. The idea, is it an order in its own right? Is it keeping a kind of stability amidst all this chaos? I don't know. It's an intriguing question. But before I go on to another topic, I want to pick up a thread here. And it's the extent to which we're all complicit in this network, in eroding our own liberties. And Ron, reading your book, should I flash it one more time? Do you want me to put it up there one more time? Reset. We share an affinity for, I think, one of the same series of slides that came out of the PRISM leaks from Snowden, who I know blurb your book. We can maybe talk about that in a minute. And the Prism slide in particular is one that evokes the image of when Apple first introduced the Macintosh, the 1984 Super Bowl. These leaked slides were from the NSA, but this slide was supposed to be, of course, it's, top secret. It's supposed to be instructing this group of people about the power of self-surveillance, and it used this slide of where the famous the female athlete goes into this room that looks very Orwellian, full of gray suits, and throws the hammer into the screen. It's supposed to represent, of course, IBM. And then the next slide from Prism says, but of course, look what happened to that revolution. It's now in this, and they hold up a cell phone. And I think the punchline is, 1984 is here now, and the zombies are us. We are creating the means through the amount of information that we put on our smartphones and who we share with and who we like and what we link to, that we are self-surveilling and eroding our own liberties. Or is it because we're ignorant about it? I mean, clearly, because of your work and others, people are more aware of this, but it doesn't seem like anybody's willing to give up their cell phones. There are some, movements towards governance. In the EU, for instance, where the default now is for, protection of private liberties. But where do you see this going? Is this an ineluctable, process that, for those, those pecuniary gains, before those desires and the seductions that we get through the internet, that we are giving up, what's left of our autonomy?
That's a really great way of phrasing it, and a good question. With respect to the Snowden disclosures, which I spent quite a bit of time assisting Canadian journalists, helping them interpret the significance of the slides and helping to publish them at the time they came out. I was struck immediately, and I write about this in the book, how largely what was going on here was a kind of piggybacking by the signals intelligence agencies on an already existing, deeply penetrating surveillance system that was built largely by the private sector. Prism is a good example of that. Of course, the NSA and the Five Eyes and others hack into things all the time, but why bother build your own surveillance apparatus when Google, Facebook, and others have already done it for you? You just need to access all that they collect. And part of that, of course, implicates our habits and our own attachments to devices and social media. And there again, I think we have to recognize that an uncomfortable truth, I call it in the book, which is these systems are actually explicitly designed to be addictive, right? At the root of surveillance capitalism is the need for, as a business model, to capture and retain people's interests. So the companies pour a lot of resources and hire a lot of neuroscientists and marketers to help refine their products and their platforms in ways that make them as compelling and as unquittable as possible. And that largely explains the paradox that we see, where a lot of people recognize, oh, Twitter's a toxic mess, and oh, I can't, I'm on my device again. Well, it's because they're designed in such a way to trigger these human frailties that have been with us for a long time. And it is a kind of painful truth, but once you see it through that lens, it becomes a bit easier, I would say, to understand the dynamics around the attraction and also the revulsion that we feel. Ask a smoker next time how they feel about smoking, right? They're both attracted to it and revolted by it. And that's the same, generally speaking, with what we see around social media.
It's also why I, every year, certainly pre-pandemic, go to Northern Canada where there's no Wi-Fi, as you know, for 3 weeks and just have that digital cleanse. I think it's very important to do that once in a while. Olga, what's your experience on this in terms of, the kind of balance between the offense defense going on between, digital activism and then official top-down surveillance in your area of expertise and areas that you've been studying?
I think there is another side to surveillance that that anthropologists often talk about when they talk about surveillance as care. And so, especially during the COVID pandemic, right? We all know in all of our contexts, we know surveillance as being something that's evil, that has to be avoided or mitigated or curbed or regulated, which is very true. And the multiple watchers that are watching our datafied traces, it's very true. However, there's another side of the surveillance, and that is surveillance with care. So not surveillance to watch someone, but as surveillance to look out for someone. And I think the reason why social media are so addictive is that we are social creatures and we strive for that sociality. And especially in lockdown, this is the way in which we connect with others. And this is a way in which we provide care at a distance. And so I think perhaps expanding that understanding of surveillance and seeing the multiple forms that it can get in a positive way, right? How people are using digital media to take care of each other as well, is just an interesting perspective that is especially relevant in these times. And so perhaps, James, you coined the info piece, right? The idea that technologies can be used creatively and pragmatically to perhaps for some greater goods, or by some different set of actors, or by grassroots actors. So perhaps we could come up with some alternative languages for other kinds of surveillance that are not necessarily evil.
Yeah, we did coin info peace as part of a Ford Foundation project many, many years ago, and it's interesting how it never really caught on. I'm glad you invoked it. It brought back a nostalgic feeling suddenly, overwashed me. But yes, that using technology for peaceful ends through peaceful means. Something we might return to, but I think I want to pick up, Ron, this idea now that, there's been a call during the COVID pandemic to, accept more scrutiny of our habits and more scrutiny of our, our obviously our contacts with others and our links to potential hotspots. And it's often presented as a temporary measure, but we see how these temporary measures often become permanent. But you wrote a piece in the Globe and Mail, the Toronto newspaper, recently about experience your son had. Why don't you tell us about that, make it a little bit, show us how it's like touching people, on a very personal level.
Sure. Well, my son is an undergraduate student, and like a lot of undergrads, his classes have moved online. And he was taking a course where it was mandatory for him to install a digital exam proctoring software system. And he told me about it, said it made him felt creepy and so forth. So I started looking into it and really came across a litany of these horror stories of students feeling panicked, and also kind of struck me as, geez, this is symptomatic of larger issues that I've been thinking about related to technology and COVID that have nothing to do with contact tracing, which is what a lot of people think about when they think about digital technologies and COVID. Meanwhile, the entire technological landscape is shifting beneath our feet as we move into this kind of new normal of a broader type of, I would say, not so seemingly threatening on the surface type of surveillance. And once these things become normalized, they're very difficult to walk back. They become a convenient way to engage. And so you look at Zoom, for example, what we're using right now, highly unlikely that Zoom meetings will disappear with the COVID virus once a vaccine comes around. A lot of companies are realizing that it's very useful to have their employees not only working from home, possibly saving them on the rental costs of large office buildings, but using these type of interactive systems that enable them to monitor their workplace environments in their homes. And there are one after another of these type of examples that I bring up in the article. At the center of it, I think, is Amazon. So, most tech companies have come out of the pandemic stronger as opposed to weaker because of our reliance on them. We're dependent on them now. Amazon, all you need to do is look out your office window to see the delivery vans kind of, tic-tacking up and down the streets, parking on sidewalks, because everybody is relying on Amazon for deliveries to their makeshift home offices. But to the extent that we, now rely on a company like Amazon, we're also magnifying all of Amazon's pathologies. Jeff Bezos' personal wealth, he's the richest person in the world, went up something like $70 billion during the pandemic. $70 billion is personal wealth. Meanwhile, the frontline workers in the so-called gig economy who work for Amazon, who are rushing up and down the streets trying to safely deliver packages, lack basic health care, are prohibited from union labor organizing. And of course, Amazon is, as I mentioned in Reset, a company that draws largely on dirty sources of energy to fuel its massive data farms, graded F by Greenpeace for ecological sustainability and transparency. So we've got a big problem. We're now more reliant on a technological ecosystem that, as I said at the outset, is characterized by being invasive by design, highly insecure, poorly regulated, and prone to abuse. So it's like we're building the second floor addition on a foundation that's already rotting. And that's unfortunate because you know where that's going to lead. At the same time, though, I think it's a great opportunity, hence the title of the book, Reset. Now that we have gone through this period and adjusted our routines and paid the price, many people paying awful prices, I think we can demand more. I think it's time for us to say, hey, wait a minute, how did it end up this way? Why did we end up living in a communications environment that's organized in this fashion? It doesn't have to be this way. And we can apply some basic restraint principles around both governments and companies that can restore not only privacy and security, but a sense of dignity to a lot of people's lives who are being treated as objects and really just livestock for these companies' data farms.
Now, this would be the point where I turn to our third panelist, who unfortunately wasn't able to join us, Daniel Dudney, who's done work on his new book, Dark Skies, looks at space expansionism and, how some of these, gazillionaires, after devastating the political economy and the planet, plan to sort of go off planet and colonize, Mars. Let's just leave this one behind and start, new, better worlds. It's very utopic, somewhat, I would say, even dystopic vision. Dan, we hope you can join us at another time and we'll talk about this because it is, we have the tools to fix this, and we need to, I think, follow some of the, incredible insights provided by Olga's work and Ron's, and also Dan Dudney's. I'm going to turn to some of the questions and collate them that we've been receiving. And one is we've been talking, this is one of the questions and comments, is that we've been talking a great deal about intelligence agencies and states and kleptocrats, but to what extent is the media, the professional media, culpable, if we can use that strong a word, in this state of affairs, and the way that it's divided according to the, not just politics, but according to the technologies and platforms by which we receive information. We all know the expressions, fake news, echo chambers, post-truth, and but where's the accountability there, and where might there be purchase for changing things around in creating counter narratives? Olga, have you been looking into this, like the role of independent media? Is there an independent media still, or where are we when it comes to disinformation and the professional media?
I have not been looking at the media side of things. I believe there still is independent media. Looking at the Ukrainian context, there are actually really great kind of grassroots Kickstarter funded examples of independent media institutions that are aiming to really reframe that narrative and are aiming to provide some other kinds of content that, out there. But other than that, I really haven't looked at the media.
Okay. Ron, what about your experience? Your first book, I think, was on this, on how changes in the means of distributing media went hand in hand with different political changes, from when we first had parchment to radio to television to this infosphere or ecosystem, as you call it, that we have now.
Well, I'd like to wait what your answer to this would be, James, because you've spent more than any of us, frankly, looking at the characteristics of large media organizations. Perhaps you can, after I just give a couple of thoughts on this. So, look, I think that social media is so pervasive right now that it influences a lot of other more traditional media. Obviously, in terms of the business model, it's hollowing out investigative journalism and local sources of news, which has combined with changes in the kind of business industry, consolidation around a few large media empires that are controlled by people who obviously want to use it to try to push a certain agenda. And so that together has really created a public disservice in a way, insofar as we rely on local news, we rely on independent journalism to inform us and to act as a check, a constraint on its own against the abuse of power. It was certainly the case in the United States that, again, this explains a domestic origin of a lot of the misinformation circulating, that a lot of it came from the big broadcasters, the big cable news, that Fox News and so on. Now you have these Newsmax and OAN and these other ones, fringe kind of outlets. A lot of people watch that and consume it and are influenced by it. And when combined with social media, it does actually segregate those audiences, which is a problem. Generally speaking, you want, in a democracy, you want a healthy disagreement. You certainly don't want people to all believe the same thing. If they did, that would be evidence of something wrong. But you don't want the polar opposite either, where they live in completely different worlds. Without getting epistemological about all of this, I think we've got a real problem in that there is no common set of criteria of how to evaluate what's a fact or not. That's kind of disappearing. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that people live in these different worlds that are tended to by large media organizations with an agenda. But I'd like to hear what you have to say about it too.
Well, first off, we allow one use of terms like epistemology per webinar, so that's okay. You can, no, it's permitted. This is a university-based webinar, so we're allowed to use big words. Even invoke French thinkers like Paul Virilio. I think when I look at the role of the media over the last 5 years, say, call it what you will, broadcast, the main cable news players, the extent to which they got caught into this, let's call it an epistemic trap, that they thought if they only disproved the lie, then the truth would out. When it came to, what was it? I think the record was 84 lies in one day coming out through the president's Twitters. And the Washington Post was very good at recording the flow of deceit that's been coming out, not just simply out of the presidency, but out of other news sources as well. And I think that was a mistake in some ways, because if you just repeat the big lie or the small lie, that lends almost some sort of either credibility to it, even if you're trying to repudiate it, but it gives it publicity to it. President Trump obviously got so much free publicity in this whole debate about what's true and what's not in each of his speeches, and before he got elected and then during his administration. I think what really falls upon us increasingly, because we're trying to, I think, find some quasi-autonomous base that's pluralist, but doesn't have to, pay the piper, isn't betokened to special interest, isn't being sort of, shaped by the so-called kleptocracies that you're invoking. And it falls, that means, upon the universities. Universities are one of the last places where you can do the work you do, Ron and Olga, that you do, and what I've been trying to do with the Global Media Project. And there, it's not simply, refuting, repudiating, disinformation and lies, but creating counter narratives that are as, seductive, as what we've been seeing on the web. And, that means having good production values. It means doing all the things that sometimes universities see as being beyond their ken, and why I'm always glad to be able to have people around me in this room, for instance. We have some remarkable folks who are dedicated to this, and that's I think going to be increasingly important as the independence of our former news sources disappear. We don't have the Walter Cronkites, who, and Dan Rathers or others who seem to represent, the face of truth. Those days, it's nostalgic. And again, I'd like to have Dan Dunne here because we've had this debate. He thinks that postmodernism is to blame, because that always believes that there's no inalterable facts out there, that there's, counter narratives, and it's hard to get to the bottom of things. Well, in some ways, I think it's a good diagnostic tool to show us how to, better react to a world in which, it seems to be turtles all the way down. It's hard to find that foundation that's going to, make us all agree about something. I think those days are gone. We are in pluralist communities. To evoke Karl Deutsch here, an old IR scholar who was ahead of his times in this regard. So, anyways, I just wanted to bring that up. We're getting close to our ending time, but I wanted to just give an opportunity to both of our speakers if you have any other insights or something you'd like to add to the conversation. It's okay if we go a little over because we always edit this for the final web version of it. But first, you, Olga, is there anything you'd like to add to the questions or key questions you'd like me to ask for our next webinar?
I guess I would just like to add that the digital literacies with which we join social media and are present on social media are only probably a part of the issue. And so, so a lot of us have different skill sets, and the notion of a native digitals is highly disputed, and it is the research shows that younger people do not necessarily have better ways of judging the credibility and reliability of the information. However, another part of it is proclamations of identity. And I think Dana Boyd's research shows that really, at the end of the day, a lot of social media users don't care as much about the veracity of the claims, as long as it helps them show themselves as part of a group that they want to belong to. And so this idea of belonging, this idea of identity proclamations made via sharing some content on social media, I think is another part that is much harder to tackle than digital literacy and teaching people how to distinguish true information from false. So that's not a very optimistic note, but I guess.
No, instead of epistemic communities, we now have these new sort of digital communities. Absolutely. Ron, final thoughts, words?
Yeah, I'll just, briefly, and I don't want to sound too corny here, but I'd be remiss if I didn't say this, that, when I first was a graduate student getting into this area, searching around for other people who are interested in the same nexus, I immediately came across Dan Dunne, who couldn't be here, but also James, and his book, Anti-Diplomacy, which was so influential to me in terms of, wow, there's somebody else who's, thinking about these things, of course, much more sophisticated than I could then. And I recall, James might remember when we first met, I think it was when I organized a conference on the politics of planetary surveillance at the University of British Columbia when I was a graduate student back in the dark ages. And I think since Dan's not here, I would encourage you for your next webinar to adopt that title, The Politics of Planetary Surveillance, and invite Dan and then maybe Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. And
why stop there? Why don't we invite Julian Assange as well and Edward Snowden? And
well, I can arrange some of that maybe. So
that would be great. That's a great idea, and I'm going to follow up on it. I really think, and also Ron, as long as we're patting each other on the back and everybody, Olga, it's great having you on because this is the next generation coming up. It's fantastic to see this type of critical scholarship taking hold. And when Ron first asked me to join him in this conference, I think it was by default. There was nobody else out there to come. So we showed up, and I have to tell you, when I got the invitation, I thought this guy was going to be met by this, distinguished professor. Here was this graduate student who had organized the whole event. It was like one of the best events I'd gone to then and subsequently, certainly on that topic. And so I would just encourage people to follow in Ron's and carry on and join communities that Olga's setting up. And that's where the hope is. That's the crack that lets the light in, to quote another great Canadian singer in this case, Leonard Cohen. And I want to thank you all for joining us from afar. And we will carry on carrying the torch on this issue because it is not going to go away. In the meantime, put your cell phones in your microwaves when you're concerned about conversations you don't want overheard. And short of putting aluminum caps on, I think we have to always be on guard that we are being watched, and we will keep on watching the watchers. So thank you all. Please do encourage your friends to watch the recorded event that will be posted in the next few days. Until then, join us for the 7th Global Forum. We're going to have a very exciting topic, and please do be well and stay safe, and we'll catch you on the other side. So with that, over and out.